democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Baghdad, the Iraqi government has announced plans to investigate why Saddam Hussein was taunted in the final moments before his hanging. Cell phone footage shows masked guards chanted the name of Shiite cleric Muqtada al-Sadr and then told the former Iraqi president to go to hell. The treatment of Saddam Hussein has sparked protests around the world. Former NBC News anchor Tom Brokaw said Hussein's execution, quote, resembled the worst kind of nightmare out of the old American West. Britain's Deputy Prime Minister John Prescott said the manner of Hussein's killing was deplorable. Well, today on Democracy Now!, we're going to continue our coverage of the execution of Saddam Hussein by airing one of the last televised interviews Saddam Hussein did with an American journalist. The interview actually took place in 1992, soon after Desert Storm. It was in Baghdad and was conducted by our colleague here at Downtown Community Television, 15-time Emmy Award-winning journalist John Alpert. Until now, this broadcast was never aired in the United States. In a moment, we'll play excerpts, but first, John Alpert, welcome back to Democracy Now! Talk about this interview you did with Saddam Hussein.
Well, everybody was anxious to find out what he was thinking after the Gulf War. Did he feel that he had made a mistake in invading Kuwait? Was he interested at all in trying to find a path to peace? There didn't really seem to be much going on the diplomatic front, and we were fortunate enough to get an interview with him, and he used it to talk about the possibilities for peace and how he felt about the war.
Where did you do the interview?
In one of his palaces. It's really a rather exciting journalistic story. They came knocking on the hotel room door at 10 o'clock in the morning, and I could tell from the way they were dressed and their serious faces that these were the people that were going to take me to the interview. And I went to get my camera, because I do my interviews basically from behind the camera, not sitting here like this. And they said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm getting my camera." They said, "You can't take a camera." I said, "Well, how can I interview him? I'm not going to do this with colored pencils." And they said, "Get in the car. If you're not in the car in 2 minutes, we're leaving you behind." And they took us to the palace. We walked in, and immediately Saddam Hussein appears, and he came up, he shook my hand, took our photograph. I have the souvenir photographs here. And then he disappeared. And I said, "My goodness, I blew it. There's no interview." And they said, "Just shut up." And took us down to the basement where I had my first and only jailhouse search. They inspected parts of me I didn't know I had. Then took me to a room, and when they opened the door, there were 200 people sitting in the room. The entire crew from Iraqi television and all Saddam's officials, hanger-on, translators, and things like that. And I knew eventually I'd be speaking to him. It didn't happen till later on that evening, but then we conducted a 1-hour interview.
Let's go to a clip of this interview.
We're wondering, when the Iraqi army went into Kuwait, did you imagine that the forces were going to strike back against your country as hard as they did?
تصورنا هذا وتصورنا ما هو أكبر من هذا.
Yes, we imagined this, and we imagined even more than that.
This is now your chance to talk directly to the American people. And I'm wondering if you could just make a simple declarative statement about your intentions with chemical weapons and nuclear weapons.
فنحن على استعداد دائم لنعمل بإيجابية وفعالية لجعل كل منطقة الشرق الأوسط خالية من أسلحة الدمار الشاملة.
If it helps make things clear to the American people, then let me tell you that we are ready and willing to work positively with all and effectively with all those who are interested to work in this direction to make the region of the Middle East a region free of all weapons of mass destruction.
We have a new administration in Washington. Do you think that there's any hope now that President Bush is gone, that there can be better relations between the United States and your country?
إذا ما توفرت مثل هذه الرغبة لدى أمريكا بذلك.
We are still willing to discuss new relations with the United States if the United States is prepared so to do.
If President Clinton was sitting here opposite you, what would you like to tell him?
عندما يجلس الرئيس الأمريكي أمامي سأقول له الذي أقوله.
When he actually sits in front of me, then I will tell him what I think I will.
And how about if ex-President Bush
was here.
من صفات العربي أن لا ينازل إلا من يكون على جواده.
And it is part of the traits of an Arab and values of an
ويكون
Arab
قد امتشق سيفه. أما
not
الآن
to fight.
الرئيس الأمريكي السابق لم يعد له سيف.
It is part of an
وهو
Arab's
قد
trait
ترجل عن
to
جواده.
fight only those who are on their horses with their swords drawn. And now that President Bush is neither on his horse nor with a sword drawn, then I don't think he
فليس من شيمنا أن
to be fought.
Basically, the people in the United States have come to the point where they don't trust you.
بأنه أكثر من بين أكثر الناس اللي عندما يثق بهم ثقة تكون في مكانها هو الناس الموجودين في العراق.
At any rate, whether the American people trust us or not I don't want to comment on that, but I want to say that the American people are going to discover that amongst the first people that are worthy of their trust are people here in Iraq.
Many people believe that if, for example, we turn around and we walk away, that you'll be back across the border in Kuwait tomorrow.
بدنا لكانت قناعة الشعب الأمريكي الآن غير ما هي عليه وفق الطريقة التي عرضتم.
If only we had the means to reach out to the American people and explain to them how the American administration goaded the Kuwaitis themselves to become part of the conspiracy being woven against us, then the situation and the perception of the American people today would have been different from what it is.
Now, whatever you think about Kuwait, Kuwait's a much smaller country than your country. It doesn't measure up to your country militarily, and the same situation exists with you vis-a-vis Kuwait.
No,
No, in other words, the United States is a big country, and the United States can push you around, and they did push you around. You were a big country, and you pushed Kuwait around. How can we stop this?
على أقل ما يمكن هل هو حالة ضعيفة؟
Would you consider any quarter or a government that was announcing at the time that they intended to, that is before the 2nd of August 1990, that they intended to bring the value of the Iraqi dinar to its lowest possible value, and that they had intended to shrink or minimize the revenues and the resources of Iraq to the lowest possible level? Would such a government be considered weak?
إذن الحكام الكويتيين استخدموا سلاحهم إلى أقصاه.
So the
لكن سلاحهم هو الأموال.
So the rulers of Kuwait used their weapons to the limit, but their weapon was money.
If the same situation existed again, in your perception, Kuwait, for example, was successful in undermining your economy again, would you do the same thing that you did before? Would you go into Kuwait again if you felt that that would solve your problem?
لا يجوز أن نسأل أسئلة افتراضية ونطلب جواب من رئيس الدولة قائم على الافتراض.
I don't think it would be right to put hypothetical questions and then expect an answer from the head of a state on the basis of those hypothetical questions.
يعني السؤال لازم يقال إنه لماذا يستخدمون أموالهم بهالطريقة لتدمير اقتصاد العالم؟
The question should be put in this way. Why should they use their wealth to destroy, in this way, to destroy the Iraqi economy?
المعروف أنه الشعب العراق العظيم رغم كل الذي حصل عليه ما زال متمسك بقيادته.
So the fact is, the known fact is that this great people of Iraq, despite all that has been inflicted upon it, perpetrated against it, still maintains its leadership and is still attached to its leadership.
ماذا يعني هذا؟
What does this mean?
يعني هذا أنه هو لديه من التفاصيل ومن الاطلاع ما لم يكن متوفرا للشعب.
This means that the Iraqi people is more in possession of the truth. It has more details about the situation than the American public.
Well, in the United States and Iraq are somewhat different. You know, the United States voted out its leadership. We did not have President Bush. Does the Iraqi people have this type of choice? Always, when they talk about you, they talk about this is a country that is a dictatorship, and they say that you're a strong man and people cannot disagree with you.
ماذا يعني؟
What does this mean?
هذا يعني مع أن الشعب الأمريكي طرد رئيسه.
It means that is at the time when the American people have thrown their president out of the White House.
الشعب العراقي لو كان ما مقتنع بقيادته كان طردها.
If the Iraqi people were not convinced in their leadership, they would have dismissed the leadership.
كان طردها وعلى الأقل استغل مجيء هذه الجيوش
And could
والقوات
have at least used the opportunity
والتدمير الذي وقع على بغداد وعلى كل مدن العراق.
and all the campaign, the military campaign launched against Iraq and the destruction inflicted upon the country.
لكي يقول لقيادته
They could have
بأنه
used that chance
لا يستطيع أن يتحمل
to say to its
بقاء.
leadership, well, no, we can no longer take it with you in power.
You're one tough cookie, though. It's not so easy.
انك صعب المرأة انك شديد ليس من سهل التعامل معك.
I'm curious, if you don't mind. When we go around town now, we see hospitals without medicine. If you want to buy a car, at the normal salary, you'd have to work 200 years to buy a car. The people are really suffering. And when you look back at the last 2 years, is there anything that you would have liked to have done differently? Great men have the capacity to look at their actions and say, I should have done something different. And as you look back at what you've done, would you have done anything at all different, possibly to avoid the situation, to avoid the bloodshed, to avoid the war?
ولو اطلعتم لتعرفتم كيف أن أمريكا وحلفائها كانوا لا يريدون أن يتم اختيار طريق آخر غير طريق الحرب.
If you looked at the situation then and examined the details and the developments, you would have discovered yourself that the United States and its allies did not want peace to be ensured.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that President Bush was trying to kill you? For example, when he hit the air raid shelter, when he hit the hotel, there was talk that you might be at that conference at the Al Rashid Hotel. Do you think that you were personally targeted, and how did you avoid getting killed during the war?
أني اطلعت على أمور مؤكد وأنا قرأتها بنفسي في مذكرات السيد شوارزكوف.
Unfortunately, I have read things in the book and in the memoirs of Norman Schwarzkopf that would tend to explain, to go along those political level.
وفي كل الأحوال يعني الذي أراد أن يضرب صدام حسين فإن الله كانت له سبحانه وتعالى إرادة أخرى.
At any rate,
هكذا كما ترون الآن.
Whoever wanted to hit Saddam Hussein,
الحمد لله على إرادة الله.
It's God's will that has prevailed, not his, because you see what the situation is like nowadays. It is God's will that Saddam Hussein is here and the others are not.
Saddam Hussein being interviewed by journalist John Alpert just after Bill Clinton was elected for the first time in 1992. When we come back from break, we'll discuss this interview and play a bit more. Stay with us. Rahim Al-Haj here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman, joined by my colleague here at Downtown Community Television at the Firehouse in downtown Manhattan, John Alpert. Won an Emmy 15 times for his reporting. Interviewed Saddam Hussein just after the first Iraq War, just after Desert Storm. John, what we are watching today never appeared on American television, and yet I think it was you and Dan Rather who are the only ones who interviewed Saddam Hussein since the first Iraq War.
That's correct. It's the only time he's ever talked to the press.
What happened? Why didn't this air here?
Yeah, I think it was probably a combination of two things. There might have been perceived pressure from the American government, basically just to not give Saddam a forum, even though you would think that if we went to war with him, and ultimately we went to war with him again, we might be interested in finding out what he had to say, any type of conversation, what he was thinking. We were certainly putting American lives on the line there, and it would be nice to sort of have a little more understanding. But this was the interview that everybody wanted, and I got it. And boy, it made a lot of people in the news establishment unhappy. We ultimately had a handshake from ABC. It was going to be Primetime Live, the main story. But I was told that Unaired decided to kill it.
Unaired was president of NBC.
Yeah, and one of the gods of television news. And it was his idea, and basically they all sort of figured this out, that if they could keep this off the air, then maybe one of their reporters could get the interview, and that's what they did. They sort of all ganged up, a little cabal to keep this off the air, and then they all began calling up Baghdad, pushing their own reporters as substitutes.
But no one got it.
Not in the United States. It was seen all over the world and analyzed all over the world, and there were some actually important news items in the things that Saddam was saying, but never was seen here. It's a journalistic tragedy when you get right down to it. I don't care about myself, but it was obvious that Saddam Hussein wanted to talk in some way to the American people. He had gone to war with us. He would go to war with us again, and this was an opportunity to talk instead of fight.
It particularly made headlines in Israel. Let's go to another clip of the interview that you did, John Alpert interviewing Saddam Hussein in Baghdad.
People in the United States are very curious if you would tell them what your policy on Israel and Palestine is at this particular time. If an accommodation could be reached with Palestine, what would be your view towards the state of Israel?
بالنسبة للعرب هم ضد العنصرية.
As far as the Arabs are concerned, they are against discrimination.
وضد التفرقة الدينية بين أبناء الإنسانية أو بين أبناء الوطن الواحد.
And they are against any religious discrimination amongst on the level of mankind or or within a certain nation.
لا يقيمون علاقتهم مع الناس على أساس نوع الدين.
The Arabs do not establish their relations with others on the basis of religion.
أو نوع العنصر.
Or on the basis of race.
Can you envision an Israeli state and the Palestinians living side by side if the solution was acceptable to the Palestinians?
ولكن السؤال الآن هل تعتقدون بأن إسرائيل ستمنح الفلسطينيين حقوقهم؟
But the question is, do you think Israel is going to give the Palestinians their rights?
أنا أعتقد لا.
I don't think so.
Would you recognize the right of Israel to exist if justice was done for the Palestinians?
If they
يعني
and if they agree that
على حل يرضي الشعب الفلسطيني فأنا قلت بأنه هذا.
I said that if they come to a solution that would be satisfactory to the people of Palestine,
وبما في ذلك الشعب
and that would be satisfactory to the whole, to everyone and to the Arab world and to
وعلى ذلك سيتعامل
including
العرب مع نتائج جديدة.
Because that would mean that the Arabs will be dealing with a new situation.
John Alpert interviewing Saddam Hussein. So this made headlines in Israel.
This was big news. Saddam Hussein saying that he was ready to recognize the right of Israel to exist, that he was ready for peace in the Middle East. They weren't talking those things in those days. And this was, when this played in Israel, my phone rang, my cousin was on the phone, Johnny, you're on TV. And the fact that Saddam Hussein was saying, let's make peace with Israel, I can make peace with Israel, was transformative. And it got absolutely no traction over here. And that's a big tragedy. And when you look at the death and the destruction that's come in the Middle East, and he was signaling at that particular time, listen, there might be a peaceful way to do this. It's a shame that nobody picked up on this here in the United States.
Finally, the footage that we didn't get to see in the national networks then, that you brought back, was about the carnage in Iraq after Desert Storm.
Well, it's the suffering that happens in all wars. Some people think that there's justification for this war, justification for that war. In the end, the people on the ground always suffer, no matter what. And the people in Iraq were suffering. They were suffering from Saddam. He was a dictator. He was brutal. And they were suffering from the shortages. They were suffering from the effect of the war. And the people were dying, especially the babies. And when you saw this, and it's something that you'll never, ever forget when you go to the baby hospital in Iraq, then and now. Because the people in Iraq are still paying the price for what Saddam did and the war that the United States brought to them, too.
John Alpert most recently did Baghdad ER, a remarkable film about the emergency room in Baghdad today.
Right. We're suffering, too. I mean, the American soldiers, 19-year-old, 20 years old, getting chopped up there. So anytime there's an opportunity to talk instead of fight, it's a good opportunity. We should talk.
Well, we're going to go back in time with John Alpert to this footage after the U.S. first attacked Iraq. And I want to warn you, this footage is graphic. John Alpert, thank you.
My pleasure.
At night during the war, 2 years ago, when we visited the Qadisiyah General Hospital, the doctors had to work under incredible conditions. There was no electricity, but at least they had supplies. Now, because of the blockade, conditions in the hospital are actually worse than they were during the war.
I am Dr. Abdul Ghaffar Hashim. I like to show you some problems what we are having actually every day.
Okay, so can we visit the hospital?
Yes, please.
Okay.
This is the surgical department. Actually, normally this room is nearly filled, and there is waiting people. When somebody come out, somebody come instead of him to have his surgery. But now, because we can't offer the surgery, it's empty.
How many operations are you doing a day?
Now we are doing about 2 to 3. Before we used to do about 12 to 15 operations a day.
And what happens to the people that are sick?
They just are waiting. They don't know what to do actually. This is my supply car.
This is the supply car?
Yes.
But doctor, it's empty.
Yes, it's empty. I mean, it's usually filled with all the instruments which we needed every minute.
So Band-Aids?
No.
Let's look at the pharmacy. Show me the pharmacy.
This is used to be all the types of intravenous fluid here. You can see only this Dakistan 40 and this one.
So in the whole hospital, you've only got those 2 bottles left? That's it?
I mean, this is yeah, we have no more.
And what happens when the patient needs the fluid?
You know, it's very difficult. Some of them will die. I mean, this is the burn unit. This kid, if we have the bandages and the curtains, we will cover him and dress him. But now we are leaving him exposed.
And you don't have any Band-Aids for this kid?
No.
That's horrible.
Of course.
You okay?
سؤالك زين؟
Yeah. Doctor, what happened to this kid?
This kid has a burn actually, exposed to burn, and she is suffering from burn. Her condition actually getting worse. We can't cover her because we are running shortages of bandages and cotton. I think she may die. Because I mean, in another 2 days she will get septicemia from the infection because we have no proper antibiotic for her.
And does the mother know that her baby's going to die?
انتي تدرين ابنك هاي بنتك خطرة لو لا؟ Yes, she said yes. I know she is.
What is she saying, doctor?
She is saying I am suffering actually. Don't let me suffer more.
Do you have painkillers for her?
No, we have no painkillers for her.
An excerpt of the footage of journalist John Alpert in Iraq soon after Desert Storm. And for those of us in our radio listening audience, you can go to our website at democracynow.org to see the footage from Iraq.